Elvis Presley sat alone in the Jungle Room studio at Graceland at 3:47 in the morning on June 15, 1977, staring at lyrics he'd written in shaky handwriting hours earlier. The room was thick with humidity and stale cigarette smoke. Outside, Memphis slept. Inside, Elvis was trying to remember how to be the artist he'd once been, and failing. His hands trembled as he held the guitar. Not from nervousness, but from something worse. The prescription medications that had become his constant companions were making everything difficult. His vision blurred. His fingers felt thick and clumsy. But he had to record this song tonight before he forgot why it mattered, before the fog in his head got so thick he couldn't find his way back. The engineer, David Porter, who'd been working with Elvis for only 3 months, sat nervously at the mixing board. He'd gotten the call an hour ago. Get to Graceland immediately. Elvis wants to record. David had learned quickly that when Elvis called in the middle of the night, you didn't ask questions. You showed up and prayed that whatever happened wouldn't break your heart too badly. Because working with Elvis in 1977 was heartbreaking. Everyone who loved him could see he was dying. The bloated face, labored breathing, the way he'd forget lyrics to songs he'd sung 1,000 times. The man who'd once been the most electric performer in the world now struggled to make it through a single take. Elvis hadn't wanted to be in the Jungle Room tonight. He'd wanted to be asleep, wanted the pills to drag him into unconsciousness where he didn't have to think about the tour starting next week. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories came. He'd been lying in bed watching television when a commercial came on. The music in the background, some generic jingle, had triggered something in him. Suddenly he was 19 again, standing in Sun's studio with Scotty Moore and Bill Black, discovering the sound that would change everything. He was 21, driving teenage girls into hysteria. He was 24, coming home from the army, ready to conquer the world. The memories hit him so hard he couldn't breathe. He'd started crying, really crying, the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere so deep you didn't know it existed. That's when the song started coming. Not the melody first, but the words, pouring out of him like they'd been waiting years to be written. Elvis looked at those words and realized he had to record it. Had to get it down, even if no one ever heard it, because maybe this was his last chance to tell the truth about who he really was underneath all the jumpsuits and Vegas shows. Maybe this was his last chance to be an artist instead of a product. So he'd called David, and now here they were. Elvis holding a guitar he could barely play anymore, about to sing words that felt like stripping his soul naked. David behind the mixing board, pretending he couldn't see that Elvis was crying. Elvis cleared his throat. You ready? His voice was hoarse, damaged by years of medications. David nodded and hit record. Elvis started playing, his fingers fumbling on the strings, hitting wrong notes, but he kept playing, and then he started singing. The song was called Shadows of the King, and it was unlike anything Elvis had ever recorded. No rockabilly energy, no gospel passion, no Vegas showmanship. Just a man sitting alone at 4 a.m, singing about watching himself disappear, lines about looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person looking back, about taking pills to forget and taking more pills to remember. Elvis's voice cracked on the second verse. He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. His hands shook so badly the guitar kept going out of tune, but the emotion in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't a performance. This was a confession. Halfway through the third verse, Elvis stopped playing. He set the guitar down carefully, like it was made of glass. Then he put his face in his hands and started sobbing. Not quiet tears, but gut-wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. David sat frozen at the mixing board, unsure what to do. Should he stop the tape? Should he go in there? Should he call someone? Elvis looked up, his face wet with tears, his eyes red and swollen. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry for what I've become. David realized with a shock that Elvis wasn't talking to him. He was talking to himself, to his younger self, to the 19-year-old kid who'd walked into Sun's studio with nothing but talent and hunger and dreams. I had it all, Elvis continued, still crying. I had the voice, I had the music, I had people who believed in me, and I wasted it. I let them turn me into a joke. I let them put me in those terrible movies. I let Colonel Parker control everything. I stopped fighting. I stopped caring. I just took the pills and did what I was told, and now look at me. I'm 42 years old, and I'm dying, and I've got nothing left to show for it except money and a big house and a career full of compromises. David didn't know what to say. He was 24 years old, new to the music business, and he'd never seen someone fall apart like this. He'd heard the stories about Elvis's struggles, about the pills and the weight gain and the canceled shows. But hearing about it was different from watching it happen in real time. Elvis wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. You know what the worst part is? I can still feel it inside me. The music. The real music. Not the crap they've been having me record for Vegas. It's still there, buried under all the pills and all the years of not caring. And I don't know how to get back to it. I don't know if I even can anymore. David made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of saying something comforting, instead of lying and telling Elvis everything was fine, he told the truth. Then stop taking the pills. Stop doing the Vegas shows. Stop letting other people control your music. You're Elvis Presley. You changed the world once. You can do it again. Elvis looked at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. But it was a bitter, broken sound. You think it's that easy? You think I can just stop? You're young. You don't understand how it works. The pills aren't just about getting high anymore. They're about managing pain. They're about being able to function. They're about getting through one more show, one more day, one more night of not being able to sleep because every time I close my eyes, I see everything I've lost. Then let this be enough, David said, gesturing to the tape machine that was still recording. Let this song be the thing you're proud of. Let it be the truth you leave behind. Elvis looked at the lyrics he'd written, then at the guitar, then back at David. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was something. A small flicker of determination. Okay, he said quietly. Let's do it again. But this time, I'm going to mean every word. He picked up the guitar. He closed his eyes, and he started singing again. This time, there was no stopping. His voice was rough and damaged, far from the powerful instrument it had once been. But the emotion was real. The pain was real. The regret was real. Elvis sang about watching his young self disappear in the mirror. He sang about taking pills to forget the music he wasn't making. He sang about loving people he'd driven away and chasing fame that had turned into a prison. When he finished, the jungle room was completely silent. David sat at the mixing board with tears running down his face. Elvis set the guitar down and sat there, exhausted, empty, like he'd poured out everything inside him and had nothing left. That's it, Elvis said finally. That's the song. David rewound the tape and played it back. The two men sat in silence, listening to Elvis's confession in musical form. When it ended, Elvis stood up slowly, every movement showing how much pain he was in. I want you to promise me something, he said to David. Nobody hears this. Not Colonel Parker, not RCA, nobody. This is just for me. Proof that I could still feel something real, even if it's just pain. David nodded, not trusting his voice. Elvis walked to the door, then turned back. You know what's funny? 20 years ago, I thought fame was the most important thing in the world. I would have done anything to be famous, and now I'd give anything to go back to before I was famous. To be just a kid with a guitar and a dream, before everything got so complicated. Do you regret it? David asked. All of it? Elvis thought about that for a long moment. No, he said finally. I regret what I let them do to it. I regret not fighting harder to keep control of my own music. I regret the pills and the bad movies and all the years I wasted. But I don't regret the music itself. I don't regret the kids whose lives I touched. I don't regret being the guy who showed white kids it was okay to love black music. That mattered. that was real. He left the jungle room and walked back upstairs to his bedroom. David sat alone with the tape, listening to it over and over until the sun came up. He knew he'd just witnessed something extraordinary and heartbreaking, the last gasp of genius from a man who was running out of time. 6 weeks later, on August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found dead in his Graceland bathroom. The official cause was a heart attack, but everyone who knew him understood the real cause was years of prescription drug abuse and the slow suicide of a man who couldn't find a way back to who he'd been. He was 42 years old. David Porter kept his promise. He never told anyone about the midnight recording session, never let anyone hear Shadows of the King. The master tape sat in a locked filing cabinet in his home studio for years. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it, but he also couldn't bring himself to share it. It felt too private, too raw, like reading someone's diary after they died. In 1993, David was diagnosed with terminal cancer. As he put his affairs in order, he had to decide what to do with the tape. Part of him wanted to release it, to let the world hear Elvis being brutally honest about his struggles. But another part of him felt like that would be a betrayal of the promise he'd made in the jungle room that night. In the end, he chose to honor Elvis's wishes. Before he died, David erased the master tape and destroyed all backup copies. Shadows of the King would never be heard by anyone except the two men who were in that room when it was recorded. The song disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. But David wrote about the experience in his journal, and after his death, his daughter found the entry and shared the story with Elvis historians. The tale of Elvis's final midnight recording became one of the most haunting what-ifs in music history. What would the world have learned if they'd heard that song? What would it have revealed about the man behind the legend? Some people criticized David's decision to destroy the tape. They argued that it was an important historical document, that the world had a right to hear Elvis's final artistic statement. But others understood that sometimes the most important art is the art that remains private, the confession that's made only for yourself, the moment of honesty that doesn't need an audience to matter. Elvis recorded Shadows of the King because he needed to prove to himself that he could still create something real, something that mattered, something that wasn't just another product to be sold. And in that sense, the song succeeded, even though no one heard it. For those few minutes in the jungle room at 4 a.m, Elvis wasn't a celebrity or a commodity or a cautionary tale. He was just an artist, trying to make sense of his life through music. The story of that lost recording reminds us that not everything needs to be preserved and shared. Sometimes the most powerful art is the art that disappears, leaving behind only the memory of its existence. Sometimes the most important legacy is the private moment when an artist strips away all the pretense and admits the truth about who they are and what they've become. Elvis Presley spent most of his final years being someone other people wanted him to be. He wore the jumpsuits and performed the greatest hits and smiled for the cameras even when he was dying inside. But for one night, in the privacy of his own home, with only one witness, he allowed himself to be completely honest. He wrote a song about his pain and his regrets and his slow surrender to the pills and the pressure. And then, because he understood that some truths are too raw to share, he asked for that honesty to remain private. David Porter honored that request, even though it meant destroying what might have been Elvis's most powerful recording. In doing so, he gave Elvis something the king had lost long ago: control over his own art, the right to create something just for himself, the freedom to be vulnerable without it becoming part of his public legacy. Today, Graceland attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. They tour the jungle room where Elvis recorded his final albums. They see the jumpsuits and the gold records and all the trappings of his fame. But they'll never hear Shadows of the King, never know exactly what Elvis said in those lyrics written at 2 a.m, never hear the raw emotion in his voice as he sang about watching himself disappear. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Maybe some moments are meant to remain private. Maybe some confessions are meant only for the person making them. Maybe the most important thing David Porter did for Elvis wasn't recording that song. It was making sure it stayed between them, a final gift of privacy to a man who'd spent his entire adult life living in public. Elvis Presley died, believing that his greatest work was behind him, that he'd wasted his talent on bad movies and Vegas shows. But for one night, he created something that mattered deeply to him, something real and honest and raw. The fact that the world never heard it doesn't make it less important. If anything, it makes it more important, because it was art created purely for the sake of creation, without any thought of commercial success or critical approval. In the end, Shadows of the King became exactly what Elvis needed it to be: proof that he could still feel something real, even if that something was pain. And that's a kind of legacy, too, even if it's one that exists only in memory and in the private journals of the man who witnessed it.